Orphie and Magus is the newest fire attack agent in ZenlessZoneZero, and she's only the second ever attack agent to pair well with other attack agents. With recent testing and experimenting though, she's shaping up to be one of the strongest complementary agents we've seen so far. Now, while some are definitely hyping up Orphie for good reason, there are equally as many concerns that some may be overlooking or turning a blind eye to. Before we get started with today's guide though, the footage in today's video comes from the creator beta server, so keep in mind that everything you see in today's video is still subject to change. But as always guys, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And without further ado, let's get straight into it. Starting things off, Orphie isn't your standard DPS. She works best as an off-field damage dealer, automatically casting her EX special when she has enough energy, and this means that she's constantly throwing out damage even without needing to be on field. Now when you do bring her on field, however, you'll be spending bottled heat in order to fire her massive heat charge laser, which caps off in a huge fiery finisher. In practice, this means that you'll apply Orphie's zeroed in buff, then leave Orphie mostly off field until she has max bottled heat. Once full, you'll then rotate her back onto field for a massive burst and end things by swapping back to another agent to continue dealing DPS while Orphie is dealing damage from off field. Now in terms of playstyle, she's like a mix of a burst DPS and an off field enabler, and in essence she plays somewhat similar to characters like Vivian or Bernice, where you're off field until you need to use your ultimate, spend energy, or reapply some buff to the team. Now let's break down her kit. When it comes to Orphie's special resource, there is a few elements that you'll need to keep in mind. At the start of each fight, Orphie starts off with 100 bottled heat and can hold up to a maximum of 125. Now with this, while you're off field with enough energy, you'll actually automatically consume 30 energy to trigger Crimson Vortex, aka her EX special. Now for her core passive, she's given a 25% crit rate increase alongside an 85% aftershock damage buff as well, and this makes her care way more for aftershock related DPS, and does also mean she can sometimes get away with non-crit rate 4th slot main stats. Overall though, her core passive is where much of how her off-field nature is explained, alongside other details like the attack increases that she gains while being above a certain amount of energy regen. To TLDR this section, however, Orphie will actually rely on using energy regen focus discs or W engines as well, but fear not, as her lack of attack will be compensated for while doing so. That said, in terms of maxing or in terms of what I recommend in order to make Orpheus's buffs worth it, using a 6-slot energy regen disc, 2-piece energy regen set passive, and an energy regen main W engine is actually how Orpheus will max said attack passive. In terms of what will actually feel necessary, however, just having a 6-slot main stat energy regen disc is honestly enough. As a final note, though, I did mention that at least having 3 sources of energy regen would be enough to maximize this passive, you should know that you will actually start to suffer or miss out on capping in some cases if your energy regen main from your W engine comes from a 4-star option, as of course you get less main stat if your energy regen main on W engine comes from an A rank as opposed to an S rank. However, at the end of the day, not capping this buff by a little bit is really not the end of the world. Next, her additional ability activates whenever your team includes either stun or support characters, but with this active, this simply does just add 25% ignore defense to aftershock damage, but it is worth mentioning that this does need to come from agents that have the zeroed in buff if you want to make use of said ignore defense effect. Now for Orphie's basic attack, this is honestly nothing special, and truthfully you shouldn't have to use this too often, as Orphie is mostly focused on using her EX special, dodge countering, or defensive assisting in most cases. But if you were looking to use Orphie as a solo / main field DPS, this is a 5-hit combo that does feel okay to use and does also deal decent damage, but of course this is still mostly used to generate energy to then use Orphie's EX special. On that note, Orphie's special attacks do actually showcase her real value as a DPS and an agent as a whole. Now when on field, using her EX special as a forward tail strike that deals damage while also increasing her unique resource meter by 20 bottled heat. Off field, using her EX special will automatically activate Crimson Vortex with enough energy, and this is also part of the reason why Orphie is so powerful when it comes to her value as a sub or off-field DPS. Orphie's most important tool technically though is heat charge, and this EX special attack is used on field and only activates when you have at least 100 bottled heat. This will then unleash a continuous laser that ramps up in power, can be used to parry incoming attacks, and will actually finish with Blazing Burst. Now while this Blazing Burst final hit deals significant damage, the real standout is that Orphie also applies the zeroed in buff to the entire team. Now in terms of what the zeroed in buff does, it does grant attack to the entire team, which of course is significant, but more than anything else, the buff alongside the damage both being applied simultaneously makes this skill extremely powerful and valuable, especially if your team can make use of it. Orphie does have assist and dodge mechanics like every other agent, but in her case they really aren't the focus of her playstyle and doesn't really change or deviate from the normal. To add to this, this, since she shines as an off-field DPS, her value will mostly come from automatic aftershock triggers, team buffs, and heavy EX attacks. As a result, you really won't be prioritizing her for on-field evasion or too much assisting, though she obviously can use either ability, especially if you're just waiting for her energy to recover. Now for her chain attack, Overheated Barrel, this lets her spin forward and fire a laser blast, dealing fire damage while also restoring 20 bottled heat. And overall, this is a pretty standard chain attack as well, but the obvious value here to using it is the bottled heat generation, so you can use heat charge sooner. Now finally, regarding her ultimate, this is pretty much just a flashy finisher that also provides bottled heat, and like the rest of her abilities, while the damage here is notable, this is also a great way for Orphe to build towards her next heat charge attack. Now in terms of pre-farm and what you'll need for Orphe, you'll need 3,705,000 dennies, 300 senior investigation logs, 25 basic burn chips, 75 advanced burn chips, 250 specialized burn chips, 4 basic attack seals, 32 advanced attack seals, 30 ruler attack certification seals, 5 hamster cage passes, 9 scarlet engines, and 60 higher dimensional data miasmic elytron. Before we get into the team section, let's quickly go over the format of this testing once again. The goal was to have all primary DPS agents' additional abilities active, since without them, many lose a noticeable amount of damage. That said, some teams were tested with DPS who didn't have their abilities active, and in most cases, those DPSs were either carried by their overpowered supports or a secondary agent like Orphie or Miyabi. For non-DPS agents, their additional abilities were a lower priority, and as a result, supports, utility agents, or defense characters were sometimes used without them, since their main role was to enable the DPS rather than carry and deal damage themselves. Finally, all characters tested had their ideal signatures or W engines and were used at M0 if S rank or M6 if A rank. Again, these results are anecdotal, serving as guidelines for each team's general performance rather than perfect representations of max potential, and ultimately, this is just to simulate what you can expect from average/casual play as opposed to min-max perfect rotations. And now, a quick/brief look at a few of the character stat lines that I'll be using to test today's teams, and if you'd like to see more, feel free to join the Discord where I'll be posting the full run results and the stat lines of characters that I used. As a reminder, the goal of these stats/builds is not to make the most OP character ever, but use builds instead that feel more realistic. To start the team breakdown though, one of the biggest discussions in the community right now is whether Orphe pairs better with Seed or with ZenlessZoneZero Anby. Both sides have their strengths and weaknesses, but there are a few points in general that you should keep in mind regarding this conversation. First, based on the wording from a recent livestream, it's widely assumed and agreed upon that ZenlessZoneZero Anby will receive a buff in the future. But as of this testing, nothing has technically officially been confirmed, and that's in reference to both what the buff might include and whether or not it will actually go live. Second, while raw numbers and results are always important for evaluating performance, playstyle comfort can matter just as much. Some agents simply feel better together even if they don't post top tier scores, and a good example of this is Miyabi paired with Alice or Piper paired with Caesar. The numbers here don't necessarily place them as meta-defining duos, but in practice their synergy with disorder cycling, shoulder-to-shoulder cancels, and tons of survivability through shielding or invincibility frames makes for a smooth, enjoyable, and reasonably scoring team even if it falls short of the top tier lineups. With this, let's actually talk about the performance of Seed teams when paired with Orphe. Spoiler alert, but Orphe, Seed, and a flex between Astra/Trigger form the strongest lineup that you can run, and this isn't just for Orphe, but for any team that includes either her or Seed. This lineup consistently delivered the fastest clears, resulting in an average lineup of 41-second finishes, but in addition to this, the lineup also regularly scored in the 40 to 50,000 range for Deadly Assault. Now, what's most interesting here about Seed and Orphe is that current results show Seed lineups to be 37% quicker when it comes to clears, and they also yield 64 to 87% higher Deadly Assault scores on average. Now, if this isn't your first team's guide video from me, you might be wondering if this is accurate, as a near 75% average increase in score might seem surprising. However, from my findings and experimentation, Orphe just really isn't designed well for non-aftershock DPS, even if you plan on using her as a sub DPS or just for her attack increase, regardless if she's paired with fire characters or anything in between. The strongest alternative to the Seed lineup is without a doubt the ZenlessZoneZero Anby, Orphe, and Astra/Trigger teams. These comps yielded a very solid 50-second clear time and regularly pulled Deadly Assault scores in the 25 to 32,000 range. Now, while this does fall behind these Seed-based variations, it's important to remember that Anby may be receiving a buff in the future, making her one of the more promising options, at least for now. To put things into perspective though, this team's clears were still about 29% faster than the average Orphe team, and in Deadly Assault, scores were still almost 54 to 70% higher compared to alternative options. Now, what this means, even aside from play or feel, is that that ZenlessZoNZero Anby was still one of the best options for Orphie if you wanted to keep her impact high. However, in reality, this actually points more towards Orphie's more lackluster impact on teams if you weren't using either of these specific DPS that are obviously designed to be buffed by her. In terms of field though, swapping Orphie onto field here and there didn't really interfere with ZenlessZoNZero Anby or Seed's gameplay. However, as you'll see in the results, the lack of direct synergy with Orphie's aftershock buffs held other teams back, leading to underwhelming performances overall. On top of this, mistimed swaps or any mistakes whatsoever definitely felt more harmful than usual, since the most that Orphie could really ever contribute was some extra damage and at best a reapplying or reapplication of her attack buff. Now let's talk about the double attack plus stun teams. As previously mentioned, Seed and ZenlessZoNZero Anby were the best attack agents pairable with Orphie, but there are some other considerations for double attack plus stun teams that you should consider. First, other attack agents like Evelynn and Zhuyuan had mild success, but in terms of free-to-play / alternate attack agent options, nearly every non-limited attack agent just scored at the 20,000 mark or fell way below expectations, and sometimes didn't even reach a 3 or 2 star clear. Regarding stunners though, Trigger and Lighter led this category by a wide margin. Honestly though, this was really no surprise. Both characters are able to synergize with either the aftershock DPS that Orphie was paired with Seed and Anby, or they were able to prolong stun windows and allow fire damage to shine. With this, lineups that had Trigger were 33% faster on average and also had 59 to 75% higher scoring averages, but by comparison, Lighter had 25% quicker clears, but were only 46 to 59% higher on average in scores instead. Now, important to note here as well is that both agents were specifically strong against certain bosses, and that meant that Trigger would perform much better against Unknown Corruption Complex, where Lighter definitely had higher scores in Notorious Pompey. Now let's talk about double attack plus support options. Similar to the section on stunners, Evelynn and characters like Soldier 11 were still passable for this section, but it's clear that ZenlessZoNZero designed Orphie to be used specifically for Seed and ZenlessZoNZero Anby. Moving along, the best support for Orphie was Astra, and for those curious as to whether Yuzuha could even compare, the answer is not really. I did test Yuzuha alongside other anomaly agents like Miyabi or Alice just to see if the trio could work well with each other, especially considering all additional abilities were active, but as a result of a lack of anomaly application and disorder procs, these teams were okay, but definitely not amazing. Regarding Astra in these lineups, however, she herself also found 29% faster clears, 47 to 65% higher scores, and overall actually just made teams way more playable when using Orphie because of all of the swapping. That said, alternate / semi free-to-play options for the premium team duos like Orpheus Seed Lucy or even Orpheus ZenlessZoNZero Anby Rina were also promising, with them even reaching the mid 30 to 40,000 range in terms of scores. Now I know this next lineup is probably going to be asked, but in case you were a die-hard Obel Squad enjoyer and wanted to see how well Seed, Orphie, and ZenlessZoNZero Anby performed together, you're in luck, as the team was really not as horrible as you'd imagine. To be clear, this lineup is missing 2 out of its 3 total additional abilities, which is very negatively impactful towards their DPS, but surprisingly, this team still managed a 70-second clear and a 27 to 28,000 scoreline, which is honestly not the worst considering you're missing half of each character's kit. If you were looking to run Orphie as a pure solo DPS though, your best bet is pairing her with Astra and Lighter. This team pushes through with a 59-second clear and generally falls in the 28 to 31,000 range for deadly assault scores, and at first glance these numbers don't look terrible, but the context definitely tells a different story. First, compared to the top Seed / Orphie / Astra teams, this comp is about 31% slower on clears and around 16% weaker in deadly assault scoring. In other words, while it looks serviceable, it's definitely behind the best lineups. Secondly, the main reason that this team is even competitive at all is because Astra and Lighter are both incredibly strong on their own. However, when you put the two of these factors together, you may actually end up sabotaging your remaining team lineups for deadly assault just so you can play the best Orphie team. The reality here is that Orphie just doesn't really function well as a pure carry compared to when she's backed by another strong DPS like Seed or ZenlessZoNZero Anby, and in this setup she's very clearly being carried by Astra's buffs, quick assists, and Lighter's stun duration increases alongside his fire damage buffs. That said, while I did find very clear weaknesses to Orphie when played as a solo DPS, I did actually find more success on solo DPS Orphie compared to playing Orphie with a non-aftershock DPS. As a result, you could do with this what you like, and ultimately if you just want to spend all time on field with Orphie, feel free to do so. When it comes to Orphie's weapon choices, Bellicose Blaze, aka her signature, is by far her best in slot. The raw stats here alone are perfect for Orphie, with 20% crit rate and 60% energy regen as free stats, which directly supports her off-field EX specials, her core passive, and basically all parts of her kit. On top of this, the passive adds a powerful ignore defense effect that Orphie can constantly maintain, and overall, given that there isn't really any other W engine with a working passive, passive that also provides energy regen as its main stat, Orphie will definitely benefit the most from having her signature. That said, there are still strong alternatives if you don't have access to her signature, and Heartstring Nocturne is the standout among them. The crit rate and crit damage from said engine, its passive that lets the wearer ignore 12.5% fire resistance, and the fact that Orphie can not only use but actually keep decent uptime on the passive definitely makes this one of Orphie's best options. For more free-to-play / accessible options, there are a couple of decent free-to-play choices. Mercado Desire is a reliable alternative thanks to its crit rate main stat and usable passive, and just like with Heartstring Nocturne, having the crit rate main stat can help a ton when building a character from scratch. That said, many did actually end up missing the event where Mercado was given for free, so if this isn't accessible to you, we actually have another that we should talk about. Cannon Rotor is another okay free-to-play friendly-ish option, but since it is a Battle Pass engine, not only do you have to purchase said Battle Pass to receive it, you're also time-gated behind the pass's re-release in order to get it to a competitive rank 5. Now, beyond this, using something like Kaboom the Cannon for energy regen may also work as a placeholder, but ultimately, I would recommend one of the others before using this instead. For Orphie's disk drive setup, Shadow Harmony is her best 4-piece set, and the 2-piece bonus directly increases aftershock damage, which is perfect since most of her kit revolves around it. The 4-piece effect also buffs this further by granting stacking attack and crit rate whenever aftershocks are triggered, and this is something Orphie can thankfully reliably activate and maintain. With all the free stats and natural synergy, Shadow Harmony is the clear standout for her. However, as an alternative, Astral Voice can also work, though it shifts her focus more towards buffing your main DPS rather than optimizing Orphie herself as a sub DPS. Orphie's choices for 2-piece sets are pretty unrestricted, and in general, sets like Woodpecker, Branch and Blade Song, and even Hormone Punk are all usable. That said, energy regen as a 2-piece effect can definitely be useful, especially if you find yourself spending more time off field with Orphie. But to add to this, stacking this additional layer of energy regen will also help with maxing Orphie's attack increase from her core passive. However, as a reminder, this is by no means necessary, so feel free to choose what works best for you. Finally, when it comes to main stats, Orphie will definitely be looking for a combination of crit rate / crit damage on 4th slot, attack percent, fire damage or pen ratio on 5th slot, and energy regen or attack percent on 6th slot. It really kind of just depends on your build. Finally, let's talk about the pros and cons of Orphie, and more accurately, whether or not you should pull for her. To start things off, in terms of pros, Orphie excels at dealing consistent fire damage without needing to stay on field, and in addition, her core passive and EX skills constantly trigger aftershocks, which then allow her to increase the team's DPS. Now, to add to this, her additional ability allows her to ignore a portion of the enemy's defense with her allies, and finally, she is easily one of the best / supporting attack buffers for Seed / ZenlessZoneZero Anby. Regarding cons, she can definitely feel worse if you try to play her as a dedicated on-field agent, and in terms of bottled heat management, many of her strongest skills require building or consuming bottled heat, so she will need proper setup and timing to reach her max damage. Now, to add to this, while she does improve team damage, her overall impact is pretty much tied exclusively to having allies who can make use of aftershocks consistently. But finally, many of Orphie's abilities have long animations and can keep her on field for extended periods, which does mean that you have to be careful with timing. Misusing certain abilities can accidentally cancel active skills already present on the field, which can then affect DPS negatively if you cancel things too early. Now, overall, looking at her kit, Orphie is a very strong off-field DPS with respectable damage and team buffing. However, on the other hand, she does also rely exclusively on being paired with aftershock DPS and managing her skill animations / bottled heat. Ultimately, her pros do feel much more impactful towards her pull value if you want a reliable off-field DPS who can increase your team's overall damage, especially in lineups with agents like Seed, ZenlessZoneZero Anby, or if you plan on using her with characters like Evelyn. But as a reminder, there are still clear limitations to her gameplay. With this, I definitely believe that she can be an amazing addition to any Seed-based team, or can act as solid fire weakness coverage in terms of DPS. But as I mentioned previously in some of my Who Should You Choose videos, if you already have a fire DPS built, or if you're planning on skipping / don't have Seed / ZenlessZoneZero Anby, I don't necessarily think that this character is a must pull. At the end of the day though, guys, this is just what I found, researched and tested, and you should definitely feel free to research or make your own choices based on what you found. But that's just what I've tested, experimented, and found with my time on Orphie. Thanks again for watching though, guys. Hope you guys enjoyed or learned something, and I'll see you all in the next one. Stay safe, stay healthy. Good night.